I'm Hale Svandieri, and I would like to welcome you all to the Wilson Center, and special welcome to our panelists. Today's meeting on male leaders speak critical strategies for combating gender-based violence has been announced widely. I was at a meeting at the Department of State launching this 2 weeks on gender-based violence yesterday, and they made a special announcement about today's meeting. So I suppose it's a very unique occasion when you have 4 male speakers discussing this issue. This program is a live webcast, and usually our live webcasts are picked up around the world. So we may get an email from different countries commenting on what has been discussed today. This meeting is co-sponsored by the Middle East Program and Environmental Change and Security Program of the Woodrow Wilson Center and the United States Agency for International Development. A special thank to Carla Coppell, who got in touch with us and asked whether we could be co-hosting this meeting. The Wilson Center, for those of you who are here for the first time, is the National Living Memorial honoring President Woodrow Wilson. It provides a strictly non-partisan space for the words of policymaking and scholarship to interact. By conducting relevant and timely research and promoting dialogue from all perspectives, it works to address the critical current and emerging challenges confronting the United States and the world. The center was created by an act of Congress in 1968. I'm very happy to introduce my friend and colleague, Carla Coppell, who will then introduce the panel. Carla is the Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment at USAID. She previously directed the Institute for Inclusive Security and the Washington, D.C. office of Hunt Alternatives Fund. In that role, she worked extensively with women and civil society leaders from conflict areas worldwide, including the Middle East, Iraq, Sudan, and Uganda. We first started working together over a decade ago on Iraqi women. Carla served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Affairs of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, where she oversaw a portfolio of cooperative programs that included efforts to assist humanitarian aid and reconstruction in Central America, housing reform in China, and post-conflict reconstruction in South Africa. And she was also special assistant to the administrator of the USAID and director of the USAID Climate Change Program. I'm delighted to give the floor to Carla. I can't see you from here, but please join us.
Good afternoon. Let me add my words of warm welcome to all of you on a rainy day. I always feel a bit like I'm coming home when I come to the Wilson Center because I worked here on the conflict prevention project some time ago. I actually won't introduce the whole panel. My job is a more limited one, which is introducing the moderator, and I'll get to that in a second. I only wanted to say 2 words before doing that, in that this is really one of the capstone events that AID is working on in conjunction with the commemoration of 16 days to commemorate violence against women and to combat activism against violence against women or gender-based violence. Sorry. That was a bad mistake. But we really thought, when we sat together and thought about what we could do most in terms of dispelling myths and talking about the universality of issues related to gender-based violence, we thought of nothing better than bringing together an incredibly distinguished panel of male leaders who have been global leaders in talking about how to combat gender-based violence, why community-based solutions are necessary, and why men and women need to work together to really combat this global scourge. And who better than Gary Barker to serve as moderator? When your name was floated, we were told you were, although you're awfully young to be this, a founding father of the movement to really engage male allies and to lead the charge in combating gender-based violence. Gary is the international director and founder of Instituto Pro Mundo, which is a Brazilian NGO that works globally to engage men and boys in gender equality and violence prevention. He also co-chairs Men Engage, which is a global alliance of NGOs and UN agencies that are engaging men and boys in gender equality, and a member of the UN Secretary General's Men's Leaders Network. And I think that it is indicative of how important this topic is and these spokespeople are, that when we were talking about who to invite for the panel, we actually came up with a wonderful selection of people. This was our first choice, and we were thrilled to have them all joining us. But the number of male spokespeople is growing, and perhaps that can be a part of the discussion and how we bring in an increasing number of male and female allies to focus attention on combating gender-based violence. So with that, I turn the floor over to you, Gary, and I really look forward to a spirited conversation.
Okay. Thanks, Carla. This is working, I assume. We're pleased to have this many folks here. We opted to do a different style than us standing up and talking, but to do it more a free-floating conversation with some questions first from us and then from the audience. And I'll offer a few remarks and then introduce the three speakers, and then we'll get going and make sure we have some time for folks to question as well. I do want to thank AID and the Wilson Center for this invitation and for taking on the issue, and it is thrilling that you can now fill up a panel with men working on the issue. But I do want to offer a few reflections before that we don't treat this as a celebration that there's men doing this work. In fact, as we start the 16 days of activism, I find myself frustrated between often our words around activism and the gap that too often exists between that, the speaking out, and the action. And I think, to me, the real challenge globally, as I see it, is how we turn these 16 days of activism, that is, of talking about it, insisting on it, being outraged by it, and turning that into 365 days of concrete and strategic action that needs to take place on the part of government, militaries, the UN, civil society groups, women's rights groups, and more groups trying to engage men and boys. I also thought it was useful for us to reflect a little bit on the size of the issue that we're talking about, and for us not to fall into a sense that somehow if we get some more men on board, we can make all this work happen in some easy way. Many of you know a multi-country study that Promundo recently carried out together with the International Center for Research on Women. Low and middle income countries, we've now asked some 11,000 men ages 18 to 60 about their use of violence against women and other realities in their life. Those data tell us that between a quarter and 45% of men report ever having used violence against a female partner over the lifetime. Between 5 and 25% report ever having used sexual violence, either against a partner or another woman or girl. Between 12% and 55% report having ever paid for sex. And of those, about a quarter report that the person they paid for sex with was a girl under the age of 18. All of these, in spite of the fact that more than 95% of the men in all those countries know about the existing laws on gender-based violence, and something like half to 80% say they've ever seen campaigns targeting men about gender-based violence. I think what this data tells me is that we know that simply making some noise about the issue, simply getting out campaigns that may be one-off or happen a few days a year, is not enough to change what we're trying to change with men and boys. So I do want to, I think it's useful to start with a little bit of some reflections about that in terms of the degree of the issue that we're talking about, the severity of it, and just how much we have to keep doing beyond discussing moments and messages like this. I think it's important to affirm that we now have a growing number of programs working with men on this issue, and I think I'm pleased to share the stage with some other men who I think share my sense of outrage on this issue, that some 25 to 40% of our brothers have used violence against women at some point in their life. And with that, I want to begin a discussion with this group to figure out what can we do that not only do we talk about here, but that we take it beyond this room. So let me end with those comments and turn to the group of us here. I'll start with introducing all three of them, and then we'll start with the questions. I'll start at the end. Jimmy Briggs is an award-winning human rights activist, journalist, and author, and the co-founder and executive director of the Man Up campaign, a global initiative to mobilize young people, men and women, to stop violence against women and girls in their communities using music, sports, and technology. And after Jimmy, we have Donald Steinberg, who is Deputy Administrator at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And in that capacity, he provides overall direction and management for the principal U.S. Development Agency and is particularly focused on the developments in the Middle East and Africa, reforms under USAID Forward, and the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. He's received multiple awards, including the Presidential Meritorious Honor Award, the Fraser Award for International Peace, the Hunt Award for Women in Policy Foundation, and the Pulitzer Traveling Fellowship, in addition to others. And then last is Major General Patrick Kamert. He's got a distinguished military career in the Netherlands with the Royal Netherlands Marine Corps and the UN, where he served as sector commander in Cambodia, as assistant chief of staff in Bosnia-Herzegovina, as force commander in Ethiopia and Eritrea, and as military advisor to the Department of Peacekeeping Operations and general officer commanding the Eastern Division in the DRC. He has advised the UN Peacekeeping Program and UNDP and UN Women on strategic planning, including on issues related to gender-based violence. There's a much longer bio on all three of the gentlemen here, so lots that could be, and we've got a copy at the back there. But I do want to make sure they've got time to tell us about their experiences in this. So I will now open up for some questions. We'll start with Major General Kamert. How did you get involved in this work? Tell us what motivated you to step into the field of engaging men in gender-based violence.
When I was sent by former Secretary General Kofi Annan to be the General Officer commanding the Eastern Division in Congo, I got a message from him. He said, "You take action," after all the dramas that had been unfolding in the Congo. And when I arrived there, we took quickly action to confront militias who were harassing the local population, including sexual violence. I was not prepared for what I saw there. I mean, I thought that I had seen all the atrocities that you can think of in my career, but I was not prepared for sexual violence against women and girls. So it was not that difficult to take action on that. And my final push over the line was the visit to Panzi Hospital. Panzi Hospital is a small hospital in the province of South Kivu, in the eastern part of the Congo, specialized in rape and gang rape. And if you ever have a lack of motivation or frustration in this kind of work, pay 5 minutes a visit to Panzi Hospital, and you have motivation for the next 6 months. So when I had visited that hospital, we really took off in all directions to make sure that we could do utmost to implement the mandate given by the Security Council to protect civilians under imminent threat, including sexual violence.
And what did you find, particularly in the context of UN peacekeeping missions, what can work, what can be done to provide more protection for women and to actually get to the stage of prevention?
Well, first of all, the troops that are allocated to the United Nations and sent there must be properly prepared. Because my experience is that people from the highlands of Nepal or the lowlands of the Netherlands when they arrive in those kind of circumstances, if they are not prepared, they walk away. And it is not at the general officers level who have to make those decisions, because we are, at another level. But the young guy who goes on patrol and sees a 13-year-old girl being gang raped by 4 Congolese soldiers, he has to take action. So the preparedness of the troops is extremely important. Second, it's very important to make sure that you can prevent the atrocities to take place. If you react, then you're already too late. Now, that means that you have to reach out to the local population. Yeah. Because if you don't reach out to the local population, if you don't communicate to the local population, in particular the female part of the local population, you don't know. Yeah. They're not telling you. Yeah. So for that you need also a lot of female soldiers, female specialists on human rights, civil society, etc., who can much better reach out to the female part of the local population. If you do that, then you are successful, or at least you have a reasonable chance on success. And the third point is you have to manage the expectations. Because as soon as there is a UN mission being deployed, everybody thinks that everything will happen now. And my area of responsibility, and I had 15,000 troops under my command, was 2.5 times France. 2.5 times France. Yeah. So you have thousands of kilometers between your north and the south. Yeah. So you have to manage the expectations of the locals that you cannot protect every Sudanese or Congolese or Cote d'Ivoire. But if you are there, then you have to act. If you don't act, you will be roasted in the press, and rightly so.
Yep. Any success story or any specific example you'd want to give us of one of the operations that you've been involved in that you think was actually made this happen, made the prevention work happen, was able to intervene in appropriate ways, prepared troops adequately?
Well, many times we were able to, when you deploy, then the potential perpetrators are scared off. And certainly if they know that you take action when it is required. The moment that you turn around when they stop you, you've lost it. You've lost your credibility. The moment that you take action, and even to use force, up to deadly force, people think twice. And second point is that you need an enormous amount of mobility, because most of those atrocities happen in remote areas. And in a country like the Congo, but also in the Sudan and Darfur, there are hardly any roads. There is no infrastructure. So you need air mobility. And you must make sure that you are 2 days here, 3 days there, 7 days there, 1 day there, that you move all the time, so that you have the perpetrators on the wrong foot. And if you, the third point, listen to the locals who can indicate where potential hotspots are, then you have to move quickly there. And so we had tons of opportunities to do it. One better can ask, where did you fail? And one of the failures is that you have a number of persons indicted for those kind of crimes, even on the list of the International Criminal Court, who are still in leading positions. And now you have, in a week's time, elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where people who are indicted even in the country itself, running for member of parliament. Yeah. That is totally, utterly unacceptable. That kind of impunity should stop, because if you don't stop that impunity, people think that you can continue with that. Yeah. Now, the international community can play a very important role in this, to non-stop put pressure on those governments to hand over those people who are accused of crimes against humanity and war crimes.
Thank you. Deputy Ambassador Steinberg, how did you get involved in this field?
Well, I think I was genetically programmed in this area. My mom, I've often said, for my high school graduation, got me a lifetime membership in the National Organization for Women. And I also remember my graduation speaker from college was Shirley Chisholm, who highlighted that she had faced more prejudice in her life as a woman than she had as an African American, and explained those issues. I also, throughout my diplomatic career, spent a lot of time in developing countries, whether it's Central African Republic, Malaysia, Brazil, South Africa, and watched the role that women were performing in societies in transition. But I think the real breaking point came in the situation of Angola. I was working as Bill Clinton's advisor for Africa, helped negotiate the agreement in 1994 that was supposed to bring peace to the country. And then for my sins, the president asked me to become ambassador to Angola and try to implement the agreement. And when I arrived, I realized soon after watching the process work ahead that women were not involved in the process, that the agreement was so-called gender neutral, which means discriminatory against women. We saw 40 men sitting around the table implementing the agreement, and thus it was blind to issues of sexual violence. It was blind to issues of girls' education, mother-child health care programs. We already had an amnesty in place, in fact, 13 separate amnesties that forgave the warring parties for anything they'd done during conflict. And in the context of Angola, this meant that men with guns were forgiving other men with guns for crimes committed against women. But I think what really solidified it was when I started to see demobilized soldiers returning to their homes. A form of peace was building in the country, and we would give these soldiers some money, a few skills, and we'd send them back to the villages where women had learned to live without them. And these men became very frustrated. They, in most cases, drank up their resettlement stipends, and then they engaged in domestic violence. They engaged in rape. They engaged in wife killing. And what it told me was that it's not enough to bring peace, that unless you bring a peace that's sustainable and inclusive, then all you're doing is ending general conflict and introducing perhaps a more pernicious form of violence against women.
You've given us an example of what hasn't worked or what can happen afterwards. What kind of suggestions would you have of what needs to be part of peace processes, and particularly what USAID and other governments can do in such settings?
Well, I think what you've said in your introduction is really instructive, because indeed I believe we now have all the resolutions that we need. We've got 1325, 1820, 1888, etc. We have all the institutions we need, including UN Action Against Sexual Violence. Everybody now has an ambassador for fighting sexual violence in their country context. I even believe we have the norms established. And I go back to 2005 when the Interagency Steering Committee put together very good guidance on how to prevent sexual violence in conflict periods. What we don't have is the political will and the resources. And so I live with the question, is everything we've done going to prevent one girl in Eastern Congo from getting raped, or one girl in Afghanistan from getting acid thrown in her face for daring to return to school? So within that context, we have to look at what the special role for government is. I believe unless governments press these issues, they won't be at the table. The warring parties themselves have no interest in putting these issues on the table. In many cases, the developing countries themselves have no interest in doing that. And so we have both the moral authority and the requirement, from the standpoint, as General Khmer was saying, of encouraging sustainable peace, to be risk takers, to be leveraging our resources to get other contributions, to use our convening authority, to set standards for how to bring women into peace processes, how to eliminate sexual violence. And perhaps most importantly, picking up on the General's point as well, to create space for local groups to operate.
Yeah.
Because as he was saying, there is an expression, nothing about them without them.
Yeah.
And we need to be guided by the wisdom of women who are affected by sexual violence themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have an example from current USAID activities that you'd like to share with the group that you think is trying to put those principles in place?
Absolutely. We have programs in Ethiopia, for example, in Angola, in a variety of countries that go out and identify groups of civil society activists, empower them through training, through stipends, often through political and personal protection, and then create the space using not just USAID, but using our ambassadors to say, here's a peace process, or here's a post-conflict reconstruction process. We want space at the table. And if you look at the conference we're about to host on Southern Sudan, we've insisted that women be a part of that. If you look at the post-conflict processes in Libya, we're insisting that women be part of that. The Bonn conference that's about to occur vis-a-vis Afghanistan, same thing. And again, it takes, I believe, an external actor, either the United Nations or a bilateral government, to force the door open.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Jimmy, what, as you all have embarked on using media and youth culture and sports to turn up the volume on this topic, tell us what kinds of approaches and messages are you finding that work, that get men to come in the door and take this issue seriously and think about it, reflect about it?
It's really hinged on several things. One is peer mentorship, mobilizing young people, but in this case, especially young men, boys, to create this space for conversation, for talking about gender, generally speaking, but how gender violence against women and girls affects them personally and then their communities. Yeah. A lot of the young men I work with, domestically and internationally, and I saw this quite a bit when I was still a journalist working in Africa, a lot of them, they buy into the same, and you know this is why I do it, they buy into the same construct of manhood and strength that many of us here in this country do as well. So, whether they're former child soldiers or, civilians in post-conflict situations, they still carry that feeling of being hard. If I talk about what happened to my mother or grandmother or sister, that's expressing sensitivity, which I don't want to do because then I'll be soft, I'll be weak. Yeah. Those are the terms they use. So we create the space for them to have those conversations one-on-one and then in small groups, and it's really a matter of reaching them where they are. Yeah. When I was first conceiving of Man Up, it was really inspired by everything that I saw as a reporter because, we're our young people. They're playing sports, and now they're involved somehow in technology, gaming, and so forth. And also there's the aspect of the arts and the music. And for many of the young men we're working with globally, we want to find, a tool that would reach them universally, which ended up being hip hop. Okay. And here in this country, hip hop has become something that's very misogynistic and materialistic, whereas globally that's not the case. It's still progressive and socially conscious. So a lot of times, the entry point is music, and breaking down the iconography, the imagery, and in some cases the lyrics of songs themselves, and really exploring the meaning behind them and how we can transform those words to something more positive message.
All right. And I know one part of your programming has been around social media. We've all been excited about using, how can we use particularly mobile phones and others. How have you all tried that, and how's that going?
I mean, it's going slowly. It's moving forward. One of the things, and it's not just social media, but it's really media in general, really is working with young people to become citizen journalists. Whether it's being able to, as a journalist, I get so tired at a certain point of having to go places, but I felt like, why can't they write the stories themselves or take the pictures themselves? They don't need me to tell their stories. They have their own voices. And so with these young people, we train them to express themselves in the written word, but also to use SMS and other social media to not only document or present what may be happening in their communities, but also as a defense. If something, if there's a situation where something could jump off or happen, SMS, they're using SMS to send out warnings about an impending attack, or this person being assaulted, we must mobilize and come to her support. Things like that.
Yep. All right. And who do you think is missing at the table as you're talking about the hip hop, trying to use social media? Kind of what would be your long-term goal of who else you'd like to get at the table as part of a voice on engaging, particularly boys and young men, on ending violence?
I think, and I know a lot of, being still relatively new to the NGO world, I'm always careful about what I say or where I say it, or not ruffling feathers. But I think that we have to, in 2011, we have to start engaging the faith-based community. It's a huge gap at the table. I just think there's so much common ground that we can find around redefining gender roles, especially masculinity, but also working with families around addressing the impact of violence. And I think that's universal. Whatever faith system you're talking about, that's universal. We have to get them to the table, because in so many communities, you have to go through the faith-based institutions anyway to get anything done. And I think this, impact on this issue is no different.
All right. I want to thank the three of you for those first comments, and we've got about 10 minutes in the agenda to open up for questions from the group. So take maybe a first round of 3 and then allow the panelists to respond, and then we'll take another round, depending on how time goes. Yep.
Thank you all so much for coming to Thank you all so much for coming to speak with us today. My name is Isabella Cochran. I work at USAID. And I've noticed that in your comments today, you seem to be focusing more on violence against women and gender-based violence. And it's more and more research is showing that there is significant amounts of violence against men as well, but it's less reported. There's a different kind of shame and honor around that. And I wanted to know if any of you are working on or plan to work on the sort of gender constructs, the overall structures that are creating violence for both genders. Thank you.
Thank you for organizing this panel and for being here. My name is Maureen Farrell. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton, but I'm doing research on behalf of U.S. Africa Command about training approaches on gender-based violence. And I'm very curious if you have any examples that you'd like to cite of successful ways to monitor and evaluate successful behavior change programs. I've been trying to find examples of successful examples where people actually substantively assess their impact. Thanks.
Take one more and then we'll respond. Okay. If not, we'll take those two. All right. Who would like to comment first on the issue of violence against boys and men? I don't know if, Major General, if you'd like to, in terms of the post-conflict settings you've been working.
I must say that you're absolutely right. There is an increasing amount of violence against men and boys, but it is an enormous stigma in Africa. It is very, very difficult to really have them coming forward and asking for help. We try in the Congo with a program which is called the mobile cinema. And the mobile cinema is a film about perpetrators and survivors, including males, that goes from village to village. And the purpose is to raise the awareness of the local population and breaking the silence. And you see for the first time that you have hundreds of people in the village watching this movie, and then there is a discussion immediately starting. And because of people who come out and admit that they have been raped and harassed, etc., people feel that they can take part in the conversation. So that is step by step a method that is successful. The same thing in the training of the government forces. There are training programs now with films to show them what they are causing, what kind of suffering they're causing, and to make them aware, and etc., etc. That is not easy to measure the impact, how if it is working or not, but at least it is a try to get those people turn around. On the second question, how do you change that behavior? Those training programs for in-country, but also the training program for the people who go there, is successful. But how successful is always difficult to measure. But the fact that troops are prepared means that they take action and preventive action when a situation might occur.
Do either of you care to comment on the two questions as well?
Actually, Gary, I'm sorry. You asked me before, one of the last questions you asked me specifically was who's missing from the table.
Yeah.
It kind of ties in a little bit, but I'll also say who's missing is at the table are psychosocial experts, trauma experts.
Yeah.
I mean, trauma is very overlooked, especially unfortunately post-conflict situations. But in regards to this issue, for both the survivor and the perpetrator, so I would say that. But also, in answer to your question, I think with the Man Up, we do talk about male-on-male violence. It's not generally of a sexual nature, but it is violence. It could be conflict or not. And I think, by addressing it, we can also address the larger issue of violence against women and girls as well. Frankly speaking, I'm always a little wary because people ask this question a lot, and I'm sure you hear more than I do, Gary. I get a little wary. I know we have to talk about it, but I'm always wary of it distracting from the issue of male violence against women. That's the bigger problem. And we know that male violence is happening. When I was in the Congo, I spoke to men who've been raped and assaulted by Congolese militia. So I'm not immune or not unempathetic to the condition. But I feel like I think we have to be careful just how we address it in the context of this issue of violence against women.
Right. Yeah. Want to comment on that?
I sort of want to comment on that and then a couple of other points. That's a very, frankly, a brave comment, and it's one I entirely agree with. This is a panel on sexual and gender-based violence, but 85% of the people in the audience are women. And so we know where the problem is. It is male violence against women. And that doesn't mean, as Jimmy has said, that we don't focus on the constructs and the environment in which any kind of violence can occur of a sexual nature. And in that regard, I really believe that we need to step back and look at where violence has penetrated the social being of societies. And I think very much about Eastern Congo right now, where social interaction is violent. Yeah. And we have to consider what the sources of that are and attack those directly. I also wanted to ask sort of you to step in for a second, move beyond your moderator role, because one of the things that we talk a lot about is breaking the cycle of intergenerational violence. Just because your father beat your mother doesn't mean you have to beat your wife. And indeed, I do believe it's a question of psychosocial aspects. It's a question of coming out and challenging the norms of young men behavior. And I would stress that indeed, in most cases, what we are talking about is the need to change young men's behavior. And so some of the things that we are doing is going into schools. We have programs to provide safe schools for girls so that they can attend without being abused by professors, by their classmates, so that they can attend school during their periods Even if they are pregnant, they can go. We are establishing dormitories so they don't have to go for hours and hours and risk sexual violence in that context. The other area that I think is very important is to focus on child marriage, which is something that we don't talk about usually in this context, but it establishes a norm in society that girls are of value because of their reproductive capability and their capacity to satisfy men as opposed to their inherent worth. And until we can get over that hump, I think we're going to have real problems. But I wanted to, again, throw it back to you to talk a little bit about Promundo's work.
Okay. I'll comment on the first question that was asked. I think we get asked that a lot, and Jimmy acknowledged that as well, of what about the violence against boys and men? I think it's important that we find ways that we don't get into a duality around that. In fact, the roots of the violence that other men use against men and boys is often the very same roots of men's use of violence against women and girls. And what we know are part of those roots are the experiences of violence growing up. Rarely does violence spontaneously show up, and I think Deputy Administrator Steinberg said that quite clearly. The nature of violent reactions, watching it growing up, experiencing growing up, your comment on trauma, the unaddressed trauma of having seen violence among the individuals who you hope take care of you and nurture you every single day. That, I think, is trying to break the transmission of something that we don't think about. And so what we know is that boys who experience violence growing up or witness it are more likely to use it in multiple forms, depending on who they hang out with and lots of other factors that come in there. And so I think whatever we do to address violence has to look at that. What we do know in most settings is that the violence is vastly larger in terms of how often it happens, of men's violence against women. What we often see, however, is that the ability to access services and even to speak about different forms of violence, that's when we sometimes see that men and boys are less likely to talk about that violence and are less likely to access services. That's not to say that we've somehow messed up in our services to women, because we've not even achieved those. But I think we do have to find ways of understanding these things going together and trying to avoid ways that we say it's either or. We've got to address them both at the same time. And I do think that we do a disservice to women and girls by not understanding the violence that men and boys experience growing up, since that is part of the same roots. So I think if we can find ways to avoid that pendulum that we often talk about, we've got the chance to really advance on more comprehensive and integrated prevention strategies. So I think we still have not figured out good ways to answer that question. It's the tough one, and often the one sort of looking us, sort of what do we do about that question, but I think it's a key one. In our work
can I just say, just to reinforce the point as well, Willie Sutton was asked, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is. Why do you go after sexual violence against women? Because frankly, that's where most of it occurs. Yeah. So
exactly,
very simple.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I say one thing on the traumas? Many of the perpetrators, and also the vast majority of child soldiers, have a post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. And what we do, we disarm them, we demobilize them, and then either we send them back to the village or we take them in the new army. Yep. So you have a lot of twisted minds, and there is nobody, there are no psychiatrists, there's no help whatsoever to deal with that problem. Yep. So you see, and when you talk to those child soldiers, you see, those young kids with broken eyes. Yeah. UNICEF gives them, 5 days of registration, etc., and then they are sent back to their village. Yeah. But those kids, they need help. If they are not receiving help, then they return to violence. And I was not so long ago in Monrovia, in Liberia, and there's no fighting in Liberia anymore. Yeah. But the crime number one is rape and gang rape, domestic violence. Because of such a long time that there is no norms, no value, no nothing, only violence, and there is no law, there is no rule of law, there is no impunity, etc., fight against impunity. It continues. Yeah. It continues, and that has to stop as well. Yeah.
Can I pick up on that? Because it's not. Certainly, it's the child soldiers, but it is the broader society as well. there were statistics in Angola when I was there that 40% of the kids under the age of 12 had a relative killed in the 25 years of civil war. There was a statistic that is just frightening to me, that 65% of the children watched a human being die. And if you think about the impact, it's as if the entire society went through post-traumatic stress syndrome, and we never figured it out because, you know, in the United States, if you have post-traumatic stress syndrome, you go through one-on-one counseling for years and years and years to get over it. How do you do that with 3 million Angolan children? And we tried to, you know, institute programs in schools. We tried to institute psychological programs, psychosocial training, but you know, I went to one of those sessions, and the trainers kept complaining that they were having kids try to get their feelings out by doing pictures, and they said they kept running out of red paint because of all the blood that these children had seen. And I don't know the answer to that, and it goes back again, Gary, to the question of intergenerational.
Yeah.
What is this generation going to be like, you know, 10 years from now?
None of us picked up very much on the evaluation and monitoring question. I'm not sure if that's symptomatic of we're not feeling particularly optimistic of what the change we can measure, but I think there are some evaluated interventions. We find that there's not many that have been able to measure changes in behavior, that is, that actually measuring reductions in men's use of violence. There are a few of those. What we're often measuring is the attitudes that support that violence, and if we can get men to have this more critical reflection that Jimmy was talking about before, there's several attitude scales that we've been using, and be glad to share those with you. At least we're measuring progress toward changing the attitudes that we know support violence. And we also try to measure, would you speak up? Would you talk to someone? I think we see another key role of men, not just us speaking about this at the political level, but trying to get men to be bystanders, to question other men's use of violence. And that's one that we've used a lot. You know, reducing the number of acts may take us a long time, but can we get the majority of men who do not use violence to speak up when they see it, to do something about it? And those of us who have been following the news in the U.S. on the Penn State case are, you know, amazed of men who knew what was going on, men and women, but particularly men around a sports environment of, you know, all the kinds of culture of masculinity around that, who didn't stand up when they saw a form of sexual-based violence take place. So I think that's one of the key things that we're also trying to measure, and I think we're still not very good at achieving it, but I do think it needs to be a bigger part of our indicators. Let's see if we have any more comments or questions before we begin to wrap up. I see 3 hands. Let's take a round of 3 and then see if we have time for more. So right here first.
Thank you very much, Pat Morris, Creative Associates. Really appreciate all of the work that you all have been doing in this area. Yesterday, Norma Cruz, the co-founder of the Survivors Foundation, was on a panel. And one of the things that she was suggesting was that there needs to be a lot more work that is done in terms of transforming the wider societal perspectives on sexual and gender-based violence, violence against women. And I would like to know what each of you think about this. I know, Gary, you started off by talking about that on the one hand, you know, the men have had, you know, this prevalence of violence. At the same time, they've been exposed to a lot of behavior change, you know, awareness programs that have been done that are trying to change perspectives. And so, I think you were suggesting that it hasn't been working as well as we would like. And then, Jimmy, you know, you were talking about that we need to get the religious community, the faith-based community, more involved. And I'm assuming by that you are assuming that there is a deeper kind of change that could come that can be tied to people's faith and you know, that sort of thing. So I'm wondering, what do you think are some of the kinds of interventions we might want to be thinking about looking at to transform this broader set of attitudes. You know, a woman can perhaps say in the Caribbean context where I'm from, you know, charge her accuser, he goes to jail, but then the wider society, both women and men, you know, she has this stigma because she has brought these issues out. So how do we attack that part of the problem? What are some ideas that you have? Thank you.
Yeah. Take two more. Yeah, back here.
Hi, my name is Monica Gonzalez, a recent graduate of the Masters of Foreign Service program at Georgetown University. My question is in regards to a comment from, I think it was the Deputy Ambassador regarding creating spaces, particularly in peace processes. How or what needs to be done in terms of not only creating spaces, but going beyond that in making sure that women's voices are meaningful and valuable in the peace process post-signing whatever, you know, treaties or sort of agreements, because while many even women's groups' presence at these peace processes happen, after that there's very little to be kind of seen in terms of effectiveness.
I saw the third hand in this direction, but I also saw one in the front here, so if maybe we can do four. Yep, go ahead.
I'm Alivelu Ramsiti from Oxfam. I would like to just get your ideas around sustainability. My experience of working with violence is not only physical violence, but violence in all forms. And in South Asian and some of the Latin American countries where violence is in the culture of the society, where kids growing up see it, it's a part of their life. So, and we all advocate working with men and boys, and it's very difficult to engage with men and boys in the community or with their groups, having that so few number of groups and advocacy networks. So in this context, what do you think are the top line ideas that to sustain this, working on men and boys, because it's individual change that brings about the social change. Thank you.
And last one here.
I'm Isabella Kasay with the Helsinki Commission, and I think the main thing that I kind of have been thinking about through this is that a lot of the focus has been on men and kind of being the perpetrators of this violence. But I think, at least for me, a big point is the women in society that kind of turn a blind eye to what's happening, or mothers that send their daughters into prostitution because either because they were forced to do that or because that's kind of how they have been raised. So I guess my question is, what is the role of women in perpetrating this violence? And kind of as a jumping off point is, how can we empower women to help themselves in the situation?
All right, that's a lot of questions. I would suggest maybe we'll start with Jimmy and work our way and then close. Comment on the one or two of those that you'd like to, and any final comments each of you would have.
You'll also have the heavy questions for the end.
There we go.
Like that. To Pat Morris's question, I mean, it's when I was thinking even during the panel, I think it's an important one. I wish we could take a village or a town or a city somewhere in the world and do like a pilot, because I think it has to be holistic. You know, it has to be. You know, I speak to a lot of schools, you know, across the country, but especially in New York City where I live, and to be very honest with you, I'm curious to hear how Gary reacts to this, what he says. You know, I go to high schools a lot, and sometimes middle schools. I get so frustrated. I get very frustrated because, you know, I go to the same schools all the time, every year, every school year. Sometimes you see the same students. And I feel like, especially when you're talking about working with young people, you know, you may reach them for that hour or two that you're in the classroom, the auditorium, but then they have to go back home, you know, to their neighborhood in the Bronx or Bed-Stuy or Anacostia or whatever, you know. And that message, you know, it can be as powerful as you know, you can muster up in your spirit. But that, you know, I'm not sure any message can withstand what they're dealing with in their communities or at home, or what the boys in the corner are telling them. I just don't know if there's a message that we can put out there that combats all of that. And I think that one of the reasons I'm so interested in the faith-based aspect is because I think we have to engage. We need the commitment, of course, but we have to engage all these stakeholders at the same time. I've been talking over this past summer, I started a conversation, hopefully we can try it out next year, but I've been talking to the UCLA's Rape Treatment Center, which is a community-based center in Santa Monica. I mean, they serve the UCLA community, but it's in Santa Monica. And, I said to them, why don't we try to take a certain neighborhood with X number of schools that fall within the LA Unified School District. And we work with those schools, we develop a curriculum. First of all, we don't work with high school students. Let's be provocative, let's shake it up and start in primary. Let's do K through 6. Personally, I think high school is too late. You're an adult at that point. You're a young adult, but you're an adult. And really, the number of people you're going to reach at 16 or 15, I'm not even sure it's worth the effort, to be honest with you. That may sound cynical, that's the journalist in me. But I think we have to start when they're young if we're going to have any chance of prevention. I mean, we're talking about response all the time. Let's think about how do we prevent violence from happening in the first place. Let's reach them when they're developing as children. Yep. At the same time, let's go to the hospitals and the prosecutors and law enforcement and the faith-based institutions, whether they're synagogues or churches or mosques or whatever. It's almost like the Harlem Children's Zone model, except instead of focusing on the classroom specifically, let's create a zone of gender violence prevention, a gender violence-free zone. And that where everyone in that community is invested in preventing girls and women from being harassed or assaulted or abused, or if violence does happen, the response is swift. And then the response is swift, but there's also processing. There's a discussion about it in terms of the psychological, the trauma consequences of that violence on the survivors and the witnesses, but also the community as a whole. And I just think we have to think differently because, especially for those of us who've been in conflict or seen the challenges in recovery, it really those situations should highlight the need for that comprehensive response to recovery. And violence has to be seen the same way.
Thanks.
Just a couple of stories, perhaps, on the question of women supporters and their complicity. I was serving in a country and arranged a country where domestic violence and rape and sexual violence was prevalent, and arranged with a U.S. investor to provide $2 million for programs to provide safe havens for women in domestic violence situations, to provide hotlines, to provide psychosocial programs. And we figured we needed support from the government to do this, and so we talked to the First Lady of the country, who said, excuse me, I don't understand this. Men in this country don't beat their wives. And the program was canceled as a result of her talking to her husband. So indeed, it is vital to find allies on the ground in the women's movement. There, again, I go back to the nothing without them, nothing about them without them, which is also the inoculation against, are you trying to impose Western values of men and women on local situations? Well, the reality is getting beaten by your husband is not particularly desirable by women in any society. On the question of creating space and peace processes and post-conflict reconstruction, again, where we tend to focus these days is on what I would call the supply side. And so we just launched a $14 million program that we announced at Afad University, the great women's university in Khartoum, to provide stipends, to provide training, and to provide physical protection for women to participate in peace processes around the world. And I think, you know, that was one of the prouder moments that I've had, and all credit goes to Carla Coppell for having arranged those resources. But the reality is that the people running the peace process have to demand women's participation. The people who are in charge of the post-conflict reconstruction effort have to demand that women be front and center in that process. And with all due respect, I used to, when I was in the NGO sector, be one of the people who was brought in to work with the force commanders and the police commissioners and the SRSGs going out in the United Nations. And I will tell you, the vast majority of them simply didn't get it. They simply did not see the connection between their mission on the ground and preventing sexual violence or preventing women's disempowerment. I would say General Khmer is the shining reverse example of that, which is why I'm so proud to be on this panel with him. But the vast majority of the people simply didn't get it. The final point I wanted to make is, let's not be holier than thou when we talk about the countries that we're addressing. Penn State, the abuses of young children in religious settings in this country. Gina Davis, I spoke on a panel with her. She has done some research and found out that there is actually less clothing on women in G-rated movies than there are in X-rated movies. So we have problems with our own children in terms of sexual roles and sexual identities. And if you just look at violence, it doesn't have to be Bed-Stuy. I've got a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, and my God, they are bombarded with violence constantly in their lives. I am not an advocate of censorship in any way, shape, or form, but we need to be providing, even in our own society, positive role models and alternatives to violence.
Major General?
Finally, because we are running out of time, unless we have the local government taking charge of it, it is mopping the floor with the tap open. You know, we must make sure that the local government take charge, because they are responsible for the safety of their own people. We can help them, but they have to do it themselves. That's one. Two, they must make sure that the rule of law and impunity and all that kind of stuff is organized properly. They must make sure that women are empowered. You have next week elections in the Congo. We must make sure that you have female members of parliament. The United Nations must make sure that you have, if you talk about the peace process, that you have female mediators. If not, then you start at the wrong foot from the beginning. Only when you have awareness, break it open, bring it to the surface and discuss it openly, that you make progress. And finally, I cannot agree more when you look at the United States themselves. Female US soldiers abroad are going in 2 or 3 to the bathroom, because otherwise they will be sexually harassed or raped. There was, I think, 1.5 years ago, an article in the New York Times with a shocking amount, high percentage of female US soldiers being raped and sexually harassed. So, you know, we have to put everything in perspective and not only looking at countries where you talk about failed states, etc.
Yeah.
You know, because otherwise we are hypocrites from the beginning onwards. And because in this country you are in a much better state than in Africa, in Angola, under the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the final point is that you're absolutely right. Senior leaders in the United Nations, military and civilian and police, when they are selected for their senior positions, we don't even know if they can swim. And the Secretary General, International Community, asked them to jump in the pool. We throw them in the pool, not at the shallow end, in the deep end.
Yeah.
But we don't know if they can swim.
Yeah.
So either some of them can swim, but a number of them cannot.
Yeah.
And you have very interesting examples where the mission from the beginning onwards fails because the fish start smelling first at the head. And the head is the SRG and the Force Command. Yeah. If they don't get it, as the ambassador says, what can you expect from the rest?
Yeah.
And if they give the wrong example, what can you expect from the rest?
Yeah.
You know, I had to fire or sending back brigadier general, full colonel back to their country because they didn't get it. And that's not easy in the United Nations because, you know, you get a bucket of mud over your head, but you have to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore we are now in the process of, and I'm doing a lot of this work as mentor in senior mission leadership courses, to teach potential SRG, potential senior leaders on all those issues. And you cannot imagine how ignorant people are. At the level of ambassador, they have not a clue.
Yeah.
They might be a very good ambassador in the national context, but in a multinational environment, they are lost. And they cannot swim.
Thank you. Just a couple of final reflections on that. I think I absolutely agree with you, Jimmy, on the, you know, we can do our group education, our talks until we're tired and exhausted and have no more voices. We certainly found in our work in favelas in Rio de Janeiro that we can do lots of evidence-based group education, evidence-based campaigns that are sustained. But unless there's a cohort of men and women from the community who own the cause, take it forward, and really are the voices for making it happen and holding accountable local leaders to make sure the services that need to be there are there, we're kind of wasting our time. And I think we do have to challenge ourselves in the modality that we often operate in a development context where we've got these short-term time frames, or we end up using terms like resource neutral of saying, what can we do that don't cost resources? Some of these things take time and they do take resources. And if we don't put those two things to them, we're silly trying to measure them. And trying to expect that we can see the change that happened. And I absolutely agree on the point of starting earlier. I think we've not figured out how to do that. I think it ties into the question about how do we engage mothers in this. For too long, the field of violence against children and violence against women sort of pretend like they're on different planets. I think the need for parenting intervention, how do we do prevention from childhood upward, which means working with parents and creating the conditions that parents can raise their children in adequate, violent-free situations, both violence in the home and outside. And I think it's time that we try to figure out how those two fields interact even more. And I think we echoed a bit here, but just I'm mindful of some colleagues in UNDP who published a study called Blame It on the War, that we sometimes try to blame everything that's happened in given societies on the war, and therefore that's why it's happening over there. The inequality, the violence that happens inside the household and outside the household didn't start in wars. It's exacerbated in wars. But the same causes exist in Anacostia as exist in rural Congo. Women's lack of economic and social participation and power. Therefore, I think where we also need to have in the room is how the work with men and boys connects up with what we know about what works around economic empowerment for women. And to me, those are some of the most interesting ways forward in this field. We've offered a lot from a lot of different contexts today. I want to thank all of you for coming and thank the three panelists for their important insights on this topic. And I don't want to celebrate that we're here. I want to hold ourselves accountable and say, what can we do to take this issue forward? So again, thanks a lot.
Thank you.